tendinopathy is a performance affecting disease. One of the issues that we've seen is that they begin to slow down or they change their strategy. If they're an athletic player, they'll start to take shortcuts and they become less of the player that the team had signed and more of, a player that is trying to hide an injury.
Jarrod, welcome to the podcast, man.
Thanks, Dylan. I appreciate it.
I'm super excited. This was very sporadic or very not planned, and so excited to get you on. Excited to talk all things tendinopathy, anything else that comes up, high performance, all those sorts of things. So very rare that there'd be a listener here that doesn't know your name or who you are. But in case there are any people that are listening and aren't familiar with what you do, please give them a brief background and then we'll dive into things.
So born in Canada, grew up and educated in Australia, now live in London. I have a background in health science, applied science and physiotherapy, masters in sports, just finished a surgical training degree at UCL and also doing a bioengineering degree at Imperial in tendons, kinetics and tendons, interestingly enough. So, and that's my background. I'm a clinician, so part-time researcher. I still do research in tendons away from my PhD. We're going to publish some papers on patellar tendinopathy debridement, which I sort of started at Fortius Clinic, which I work at. And so a clinician and researcher. I'm just looking at Achilles and patellar tendons all day. So fun stuff.
Sounds like a good life to me.
12 centimeters of the human body.
Yeah,
exactly.
I love it. So Jarrod, what my thoughts were on our conversation today is maybe we can just get a high level pathophys of patellar and Achilles, get a better understanding for the listeners of, what's going on when we actually get an irritated tendon or a pathological tendon, and maybe if there's differences between the two. And then from there, we can just get a better understanding of best practices, management, inside scoop into kind of where you see the industry as a whole from tendon management going. Yeah.
So I think, there's been a bunch of papers written in over years past looking at what causes tendinopathy. And, I think we're pretty clear on why there is a systemic, which I think is really important and is often overlooked, a systemic hormonal, metabolic, we call them tendinopathies, which might be related to anything from having gout, diabetes, high cholesterol, having taken a fluoroquinolone, which is a very strong antibiotic, to, we see postmenopausal women or perimenopausal women, so altered hormone profiles. So that's one element. There's the elite sporting population, which is repetitive high loads, repetitive high plyometric loads. And I think when we look at the Achilles and patellar tendons, they really are quite different tendons. And we think that people get patellar tendinopathy for different reasons, and I'll go into that in a minute. But with the Achilles, I think one of my sort of biggest standing on a soapbox would be, what is the diagnosis? Because with Achilles, there are many different sub-diagnoses. You've got, insertional, and it could be from a Haglund's, it could be from bursitis, which often comes from the tendon. It could be plantaris related. It could be a linear tear. It could be a partial tear. There's many different reasons why people get Achilles tendinopathy. And it is load related, parking the hormonal side or the metabolic side, just to one side for a minute. Healthy young individual, why do people get Achilles problems? And, it can be, changes in loading rates, high or low to high, or low to high and back to low again. It can be from anything from changes in footwear, changes in surface, changes in position, changes in minutes. All those sorts of things are really important. But I think the diagnosis is really key. And in our clinic in London, which I do at Fortius with Dr. John Houghton, and we have our orthopedic surgeons, Prof. Calder, Johan Tudor-Jones. We have now Peter de Hoog, who is at FIFA. And we have a bunch of knee surgeons as well, is that we're really trying to understand why do people get this and what's the diagnosis? Because the diagnosis is really key. If you have plantaris-related mid-portion Achilles tendinopathy, you would manage that completely differently from an insertional problem. If they've got a Haglund's, which they quite often do, what is the management of it? And so, I think pathophysiology-wise, you can go through the different spectrums of acute, subacute, and chronic tendinopathy. But I think quite often it's caused by something, and whether it's load-related or mechanical or anatomical, they're quite often, the key reasons why people develop tendinopathy. In the patellar tendons, a little bit different. So we, as I said to you before, we set up the elite tendon unit at Fortius, and part of that is really looking at dealing with surgically patellar tendinopathy. And so I took over 3 years ago the Hocken-Alfredson patellar tendon debridement and scrape. And so, we have patients and athletes that have long-standing patellar tendinopathy. And when we're looking at them, what we found is we do x-rays, so weight-bearing x-ray in 30 degrees lateral view, looking at their Blackburn Peel Index, which is a measure of whether or not they're Alta or Baja. And what we found is in the 75 cases in the last 2 years that we've operated on is that all but 5 are Alta. Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the things that, when we'll publish some work on it, and then we're waiting for our 12-month follow-up data, is what we found is that quite a lot, almost all of our cases that have really indolent patellar tendinopathy that's very, very chronic, they're all Alta. Mm-hmm. And so we're using the bioengineering department at Imperial to set up a rig and look at the forces related to when patients have Alta or whether they don't. Mm-hmm. And what we're finding is that when you look at the forces on the proximal patellar tendon, if if your kneecap sits very high, is that the forces on that ventral or deep surface of the tendon is very, very high. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we, in those cases that have a BPI of 1.4, which is very, very high, we set our threshold at 1.2. If you're 1.2 or below, then we will do an ultrasound guided debridement. But with a caveat that if you're sitting at 1.2, you may well need to have what we call a TTO, which is we distalize your distal insertion, not actually the insertion, but distal to it. We distalize it that way. You're not Alta anymore. And what we're finding is those cases do brilliantly well, even in elite sports. So we've done a bunch of rugby players and football players. And those patients that have very, very high kneecaps, if we just do a patellar tendon debridement, we're finding that they potentially don't do as well as those that might have a TTO. So that's one element of it. I think, that's the sort of the more aggressive option. And then you'd probably say, so Jarrod, that's great, that's surgery, but what does the rest of us do when we're trying to manage these patellar tendinopathy cases? I think one of the most important things is a loading strategy. Yeah. And many years ago, Mads Konsgaard wrote a paper looking at cortisone injection and decline squat and a heavy slow resistance program. And that really guides our management of patellar tendinopathy. And we know that tendons are very load sensitive structures. They're a little bit slow in changing their structure, but they do nevertheless change their structure. And so I presented some years ago back to the Copenhagen group where I do part of my PhD with Peter Magnusson. I presented back to them a modified Konsgaard. Mm-hmm. Because the Konsgaard program was, 5 double leg exercises, which in a clinical environment and an elite sport environment can be very, very difficult because of the loads that these athletes are already under. And so basically it's single leg press. It's a squat variation. It can be a hack squat, back squat, front squat, and then knee extension. And then the caveat to the knee extension is if you're Alta and if your patient is sitting there or your player is sitting there and their kneecap is sitting very, very high and pointing to the ceiling, they likely won't want to do knee extension because it's uncomfortable, particularly when they're in full extension. Their kneecap sits well out of the femoral groove and they really struggle with it. So, I say if they can do knee extension without any crepitus or any, retropatellar knee pain, go ahead and do it. It's a great exercise. All exercise is a good exercise until it's not. Mm-hmm. Leg press and a squat variation, and they do that 3 times a week. And it's heavy. We know that tendons really do need a heavy load to remodel. Mm-hmm. And so, some of the early Alfredson work, bless him, Hakan has done an amazing job taking our profession forward. But, some of the earlier work, which was, a decline squat, which has a shearing effect, and Jill Cook brought that up many years ago. And she was 100% correct. That's been proven quite recently by a researcher in Copenhagen whose name is, now I'm just going to forget his name, but it's an unusual name. It'll come to me in a minute, who looked at the compressive effect at the calcaneal insertion. And so, a loading strategy is our best way of managing patellar tendinopathy. Same with Achilles, because we're trying to get the tendon to remodel. Yep. I often say, if we're talking patellar tendon patients, I often say, look, if you haven't tried a loading strategy, if you haven't done good exercise and you haven't tried to get your quad mass back up and, really improve the tendon structure if you can, then that's your first point of call. You need to go and do that. Everything else, whether it be adjuncts of, acupuncture or laser or, any other those fruitful modalities, they're probably not going to move the needle. Loading is really the important thing. And so, not that I'm on a valid podcast, but testing for me is really, really important. So understanding where these athletes are at, because I probably should have led with it, but tendinopathy is a performance affecting disease. Yeah. So athletes it's not like a hamstring tear. You can run, you can't run. People, players, athletes and non-athletes will warm up. Their tendons will, they'll get on the leg press, they'll get on the bike, they'll feel good. And they can play a football game or a basketball game. But one of the issues that we've seen is that they begin to slow down, or they change their strategy. If they're an athletic player, they'll start to take shortcuts and they become less of the player that the team had signed and more of, a player that is trying to hide an injury. And so they, particularly with, patellar and Achilles, they become less athletic and they'll maybe won't jump as high, or they won't go for the ball when they probably might have in years gone past. So, tendinopathy needs to be managed a lot better. And I find, unfortunately, over the years that, patients are looking for a shortcut. Athletes are looking for a shortcut. And I saw one the other day, listen, she was a perimenopausal woman, and she said, "Are you sure there's no injection I can have?"
Yeah.
And the answer to that is absolutely not, because any injection is what you're asking for is a corticosteroid injection, and your risk of damaging the tendon is much higher. So yeah, I think there's, from my point of view, it's the testing is really important. And I often get teams to send through their testing data, whether it be patella or Achilles. The Achilles, for me, some of the interesting stuff is the bent knee ISO. I think that's a really reliable test. The noise around it is a lot less. There are other testing methods that, I think are definitely useful. But for me, I need something with no noise. So I implore and I ask teams to use a bent knee ISO, whether it be on a force frame, because I think that's the way the force frame has been redesigned, I think is really useful. It's quick, easy. I get them to lunge into the position. Or whether it be on force platforms. And so, the bent knee ISO is a bit more challenging on force platforms just because of the rig, but you guys kindly designed me a rig for my PhD some years ago, which I actually still use in clinic. I think is really useful. But I think the strength testing is really important. And Seth O'Neill, who's a colleague and friend of mine, is going to publish some data in rugby. I'm doing the same in the Premier League. So looking at CMJ with patellar tendinopathy and using UTC scans, and then seated ISO and Achilles tendon scans to see if structure and kinetics is a risk factor for developing symptoms in season. And thus far, it seems to be a risk factor. So for me, I've always, as people know me, structure in the Achilles and patellar tendon, more so the Achilles is very important. Elite level athletes can't function with very altered structure. And they also can't function very weak. And so I think profiling teams in the preseason, understanding and identifying and stratifying the risk, those that have altered structure and those that, aren't particularly strong, whether it be their seated ISO or whether they have, very long contraction durations in their CMJ. I personally am not that interested in jump height because I think it's a variable that can stay very constant, but their strategy will change to maintain that jump height. Right. So for me, how an athlete performs, whether it be depth, speed, or contraction duration, those things are what moves my needle. And I'm interested more in that when we're talking patella and Achilles. But, I think the preseason screening is really important. Understanding an athlete's kinetics, as well as from a tendon perspective, their structure, I think really is a defining factor for whether or not they will develop symptoms in season.
100%.
That was a bit of a diatribe.
No, there's so many follow-ups. This is great. So I'm gonna backtrack to the beginning of your response, talking about structure and its influence on tendinopathy and all these sorts of things. I can almost see this thought process where you have a patella alta, right? The patellar tendon is now therefore longer compared to, patella baja. Do you think that there's any kind of influence of the actual length of the tendon itself when it comes to strain rates or the total amount of strain? Is that part of the pathological process?
I think it's more about the angle. So it's when people flex their knees, it's more about the ventral surface of the tendon is under a little bit more strain. But if we talk about length of a tendon, you know, those athletes that have very, very long tendons, it's hard to stiffen. So what makes athleticism? You know, what is actually that makes athleticism? What makes an athlete really great? For some athletes, it's about, you know, in a quarterback, for example, and I'm not hugely au fait with the NFL, but I do work with NFL players. You know, quarterbacks don't have to be massively athletic. They have to process game speed and plays and movement. But some athletes rely on their athleticism. But what is athleticism? It's rates of force development. It's the ability to generate peak forces very, very quickly, contact durations, all that sort of stuff. And so, you know, tendinopathy affects that massively. So, you know, those that have very, very long Achilles tendons, as an example, it's very hard for them to stiffen. So they need massive calf gastroc contraction to stiffen that Achilles tendon. And I actually, interestingly enough, saw we call them operatives, but he's a SAS agent for the UK government the other day, and he ruptured his Achilles tendon. And his tendon was really, really, really long, like really, really long. It was, you know, 10 and a half, 11 centimeters. And he'd ruptured and he was a little bit hypermobile. And so, you know, patients like that will always struggle to generate stiffness and therefore potentially be athletic. If you're very mobile, you've got a long Achilles tendon, you need a pretty solid calf muscle to be, to be athletic. And that's why testing is really important. That's why understanding, you know, what's his calf strength like, what, you know, because the military in the UK does they use a lot of valved products, but they have a whole Vold lab actually at some of their bases. And, you know, they do a lot of calf testing to understand strength, because strength is really important. So that rate of force development, the force is the strength. And so that's really, really important. So, you know, for me, length of a tendon is really important and it potentially can cause tendinopathy. Absolutely.
Yeah. I feel like somebody who I know you know as well, Jake Tura, he and I had a couple conversations and we had gone back and forth about this of just like, you know, we always go back to this idea of like, okay, if you're thinking about rehab, you know, the strain of a tendon, there's a proposed sweet spot, you know, get into 4.5 to 6% strain or whatever, but 4.5 or 6.5% of 6 centimeters is different than 4.5 or 6% of 10 centimeters.
That's right.
And so if you have a longer tendon and you still have that same percentage strain,
much higher force to do that.
Exactly. You need much higher force, and also the actual length change of that is going to be greater, you know?
Right.
And so it's always a thought process that I've like kind of been mulling around in my head over and over and being like, is that something that is therefore, you know, maybe not necessarily pathological, because you also see like articles from, you know, tribes in East Africa that like are, you know, like the Maasai tribe, where they can just bounce off their ankles constantly. But when they measure the length of their tendons, it's longer than the European groups. But
also their body weights are a lot less.
Exactly.
So that's one thing. You know, I read, what's his name? I can't remember his first name. Epstein, who wrote a couple of books on the what's it called? Something gene, I can't remember. And he wrote some really interesting and did his own research. And I've actually met him once before. It was a really interesting conversation. I met him at a conference. I can't remember, maybe it was a Leaders in Performance conference. And, you know, we were talking, and he'd done his own research in some of the polymorphisms that affect the Col 505 polymorphism in tendinopathy. And, you know, he was talking about some of the different anatomical differences that some human beings have. And some of it is, you know, shank weight and length, which makes why some countries have better long distance or middle distance runners than others. And that comes down to whether it be tendon length and them being able to recycle energy, the weight of their shank, because that's really important. You know, a couple of kilos, multiply that by thousands of steps, makes a massive difference. So yeah, tendon length is really, really important. You know, we think that fast ballistic athletes that have shorter tendons do better because it's less of a length of a tendon that you have to stiffen. You know, some of the best athletes I've ever worked with in the world, and I've been fortunate enough to work with some of the fastest and best athletes in the world, they have really short tendons. because they can generate force very, very easily because their tendons are quite short. That being said, when everything goes sideways, they're much, much harder to look after because they don't have a lot of tendon to play with. But so, yeah.
Yeah. No, at the end of the day, what the function of you zoom out 10,000 feet and the basic function of a tendon is to transmit force, right?
That's right.
And so like the shorter time delay essentially that you can have from the muscle that is producing force to the bone that is, being acted upon. In theory, it makes sense. The shorter tendon, less time delay, you're going to be better off in force application. But
for speed requiring athletes, absolutely. But in those athletes that are middle and long distance, they don't want short tendons because it's not efficiency. They need it spring, so they need to recycle energy. And so, Sebastian Baum and Adimantas Harampatzis wrote a really interesting paper on, it is not a one size fits all for tendons. And they looked at different athletic groups. And I think that's really important. You don't want, I remember this in the UK, I do see a lot of military people, but just because of one of the surgeons I work with, Professor Calder, has a lot to do with the military. And he sent me a patient that was SAS and he loved to do ultra marathons, but he had calves that were bigger than my quads and he had tendons that were about 2.5 centimeters free tendon length. And it's a really difficult conversation to say to him, hey, you're kind of not really built to do ultra marathons. You're not recycling energy. You've got these huge calves. He had repeated calf tears. And I kind of said to him, like, I don't really know how to say this to you, but your physiology is not one made for running ultra marathons. You might need to kind of rethink this a little bit. And he kind of got a little bit offended and I explained to him why. And he sort of said, well, that kind of makes sense. So horses for courses, as they say.
I love it. Jarrod, when we're talking about a lot of these sorts of things, right? Different tendon lengths, different, strain rates, all these sorts of things. When you're looking at someone's physiology, does that change your perspective on test position, types of testing, any of those sorts of, let's use the example of short versus long Achilles.
Yeah.
Are you testing people in greater or lesser degrees of dorsiflexion because of that? Is there different peaks that you're looking for because of those sorts of things? Or are you just trying to make sure that there's like a quality benchmark or a standard that you're hitting?
It's a really good question. I think the inter-tester reliability is important. I want to test that athlete repeatedly in that same position. So I put them in maximal dorsiflexion. We wrote a paper at Imperial some years ago. I was helping one of the PhD students and we looked at the fact that if you want to generate the most amount of torque, you have to take the tendon to end range dorsiflexion. And that was actually the most amount of torque is with a straight knee at the end range dorsiflexion. And so that was Marvin Ye's PhD. And when I'm testing, I want to make sure that I test that athlete in the same position. So I write down, because Val is beautiful, they have the numbers. So you write where their toe is, put them under the force frame, write the number where the force frame drops down to, and off we go. It's important that the athlete feels like they can generate the most amount of force. Where do they do that? In end range dorsiflexion. So there has to be tension on the Achilles. It's sort of like the old, I don't know how old you are if you remember, but when I grew up, we had telephones that had spiral cables. They make terrible force generators because the excursion is too long. Whereas if you just grab any cable nowadays and just pull it like this one here, you're going to generate good stiffness with it. And so, it's about trying to get those athletes to end range dorsiflexion. I use a lunge position. I do single leg at a time because the force frame, its redevelopment has been, for me, means I don't have to pull out the force platforms every time. So for me, it's a lot easier. And put them in end range dorsiflexion and test them. And so, in terms of testing a large group, I get them, each athlete come in, they'll do lunge into let's say they're lunging left foot forward, do 3 contractions on the left, change legs on the right, and they're done. Write down where their toe is. Can they generate most amount of force? Great. Drop the frame down on, write the number, and off they go. And we just keep on repeating that test for them through the season.
Yeah, and the kneeling assessment, it's great just because you talk about seated and most of the time you're not changing the chairs, right? You're not changing chair height, you're not changing any of those sorts of things. But kneeling, it's based on their own anthropometrics, right? It's based on their femur length, their hip height.
Super easy.
100%.
The way the frame now, the new force frame, which I got to play with I think 6 months ago, where you can just pull and drop it down. For me, that's game changing. And the fact that it doesn't flex. I mean, years ago, I used to go to Watford Football Club and test with them. And we tried to sort of set up different rigs, and we were using the force frame. But the problem was we couldn't get the right position, but also the frame would flex. And so now we don't have those problems. And it's just, my life is so much easier when I go into teams and I say, right, please use this new force frame, which they will do. And a lot of them have changed their equipment. So they use the force frame, and the data, the data is reliable because it's pretty, pardon the expression, idiot proof.
Yeah.
And 100%. Bless Vald and all the engineers that have redesigned the technology, but it is kind of idiot proof. And it makes, for someone like me that just wants a macroscopic view, what's their strength relative to their body weight, single leg, if we're looking at drop jump or CMJ, it's kind of a bit idiot proof, and that's kind of how it should be.
100%.
It makes capturing data easy. It makes analysis easy, and just having a listen to, the Vald AI is, I mean, that's a leap in a whole new direction, which is pretty exciting for someone that looks at lots of data. I mean, my PhD is the kinetics of tendinopathy, which I mentioned before, and it's looking at CMJ and seated ISO across 7 Premier League teams. There's a lot of players in each Premier League team. So
data.
Interesting.
That's awesome. Have you, I'm curious, I've done it a little bit, but given my, day job of working with Vald, the number of athletes that I interact with is considerably less than yours. I've gone through this, there's a paper released in 06 or 07 from Souza and colleagues, and they looked at muscle tendon dynamics in a drop jump. And they saw that after a certain threshold or a certain height, contraction type became shifted from that, classic in the lower limb quasi iso contraction into this, quasi isometric to eccentric, essentially demonstrating calf experienced a little bit of overload to the point where it could no longer withstand, the forces applied to it.
Has to yield. Yeah.
Exactly. Has to yield. And so, the where my head goes into those sorts of areas is drop jump profiles and being able to understand, hey, is this the way in which we're now better able to diagnose plyometric loading? I'm just curious, what have you guys found, or what have you been playing around with recently when it comes to measuring, monitoring plyometrics when it comes to tendon rehab, and how have you been kind of substantiating those ideas?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. So there's 2 people that I've sort of relied on, and if you look at Karen Silbernagel's group over in Delaware, they've done some great research, and Karen's a dear friend of mine, and she does some awesome research, and they basically looked at inverse dynamics of different kinds of exercises and the intratendinous loads. And I think, what that does is it allows rehab specialists, or even just people in a clinic to say, how are we going to progress you through your rehab?
Yeah.
The other one is Eamon Flanagan. I don't know if you know Eamon. Yeah, he's very clever and very eloquent, and I love the Irish accent. It's super sexy. But that, the way that he objectively looks at plyometrics, I think, is super clever, and for me, I listened to one of his podcasts years ago, and it really does change how you perceive a plyometric exercise. What is the load? What is the intratendinous load? What's the speed of loading? Because speed of loading is really important. That's why people rupture tendons, right? Speed of loading. If you can apply a huge force on a tendon slowly, you have no problem. You apply that half that force super quickly, it will rupture. And so, Eamon Flanagan's work in some of the plyometrics has been super, for me, very important, understanding how you progress an athlete. For me, I go by the slow and low to start with. A slower contraction type and a low plyometric load, to fast and high, which is your drop jumps off, whether it be 40, 60, whatever it be. And so the plyometric load, I think, in your rehab progressions is super important. I'm in the unfortunate position where when patients come to see me at Fortius, I give this wishy-washy, over broad, and then progress to walk to run, alter G, walk to run, and then a plyometric progression. And I don't get, unfortunately, unless I'm at a club, I don't get okay, so this is where you need to go, and here's the detailed plan of their plyometric progressions. And it's only when physios, they get back, or they get their letter and they go back to their club and they go, what on earth does he mean by that? And they'll call me, and then I can have that discussion, but it's a very difficult discussion to have. I only get so this is how I progress it. And they go, okay, well, there's no detail in that. And I'm like, yeah, I'm really sorry, but we've only got 45 minutes as a consult, and we've just done 2 scans and a clinical consult. So, but I think, back to your question, I think the plyometric progression is super important. And that's why, our clinic, I have a clinic in Chelsea, another clinic, just a physio clinic. And we have, we have force decks, and we have an ISO rig. And, part of when I started using the force decks product at the clinic was trying to educate people on choose a test that's appropriate. Okay. And I think that's really important as well, is, getting someone, whether it be, I'm going to use an old man that can't jump, getting him to do a counter movement jump when he doesn't get off the plates, or he does a centimeter, is kind of like, maybe that's not the best test for him. And I remember I ended up seeing, a test being done on a patient. And, I took the clinician aside and said, hey, do you think that's the best test? She can't really get off the plate. And he was like, well, what do you mean? And I was like, well, that's what I mean. What else do you think you could do to understand where she's at in her rehab progress? And so part of it is maybe she needs a strength test, or maybe you just do a squat test, or maybe you do a sit to stand test, or so. Yeah, I mean, it's, using a bit of technology, whether it be one of the products of Vald, but using technology to answer the question of how do you progress your plyometric progression, I think is really important. So I use, force decks when I'm progressing an athlete to a drop jump. Let's have a look. What can you do? In the NBA, don't do single leg drop jump anymore, because some of these athletes are worth a little bit more than I'll ever make. And so if they damage themselves, I don't want to be liable, but I do double leg drop jump. So.
No, it's great. And it's, in my opinion, it should be like this intuitive idea, right? How are you going to progress a strength training regime? Well, you're going to look at what they're capable of doing, and then you're going to say, all right, what is the next step? Are we going to increase load, increase volume, increase intensity, increase rate, whatever those sorts of things are? Cool. Why are plyometrics any different? They shouldn't be, in my personal opinion. But
it is a prescription.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. Jarrod, there's a bunch of different ways that we can go into this, and I want to be respectful of your time because this is very impromptu. But I guess closing things out and getting a better understanding of, just in general, what is the next thing that's kind of like making you tick when it comes to tendon measurement, tendon management? What's on the horizon? What are you guys looking forward to?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and you're not probably going to get the answer you want. For me, I'm spending a lot more time in surgery. So for me, I quite enjoy doing these operations, and I do them with a bunch of different surgeons with knee and foot and ankle. For me personally, it's doing a bit more surgery and looking and writing papers on the outcomes of those, because we do this, the Alfredson patellar tendon debridement, and we're getting really, really good results with it. And I think, there's an element of the rehab side is, I don't want to say easy, but it's, if you get nice and strong and you fail conservative management, then what's the next step? Because I don't feel the evidence doesn't support injection therapy. Contrary to some of my sports doctor colleagues here in the United States and in England, injection therapy is not particularly useful in patellar tendinopathy. It might have a place in Achilles, just because we can load a lot heavier and a lot higher in the Achilles and therefore have a better effect on it. But is it the injection or is it the loading? Hard to know, chicken or the egg. But for me, what's exciting, there's been some new bits of kit that's coming out looking at shear wave. And I think that potentially could be a new area, tensometry, that kind of thing. As you know, I have done for probably 10 years now, used UTC machine. And so I'm not sure how much more development's going to go on with that. But, from a research perspective, it's actually, I've collected all my data in the Premier League. It's now actually writing it, which is the hard bit, is sitting down and concentrating and writing a PhD, which is by no mean feat. So that's one element. But, for me, it's actually the surgical side of things. I think that's really, really exciting. Understanding and looking, and we collect a lot of information in a pre-op workup. We have MRI and X-ray, but also their history. What have they had? How long have they had it? What their age group, what their sport is, how long have they had symptoms for? And we're going to publish some really interesting papers in the patellar tendon and hopefully soon the Achilles as well. in our surgical outcomes. And hopefully that sort of changes how people perceive patellar tendinopathy, because I think, looking at our data, and we've got a large data set, we've done over 75 patellar tendon surgeries, maybe it's that a lot of these athletes that have really bad patellar tendinopathy, they're alter.
Yeah.
And maybe identifying them at a younger age and changing how they load might help them. I'm not one for human carpentry, which would be a TTO, but nevertheless, I do assist with that surgery, and I've got one on Wednesday. But it is useful. And so actually trying to explain to people, you can inject that tendon 10 times. It might not make any difference because your biomechanics are that your kneecap's sitting halfway up your thigh. And I can thank my surgical colleague, Sam Church, who, I'll never forget. I used to knock on his door and say, Sam, I have a really interesting patient for you. He's an athlete, plays for X team, and he's got really bad patellar tendinopathy. And he would just look up at me every single time and say, yeah, he's probably got patellar alter, and look back down in his notes. And it took a while for that to sink in. And I'm fortunate now that I work with another surgeon, Mr. Sanjay Anand, who's a patellofemoral specialist. And, we do these surgeries. But, from a tendon perspective, I think the outcomes of those would be really interesting. Technology-wise, I'm not sure there's a huge amount that's coming out, but my PhD, hopefully, and some of Seth's work will hopefully answer the question of how relevant is kinetics and the importance of structure. And so I am big into the importance of Achilles tendon structure. I think it's very hard to play at the speed at which gameplay is, whether it be basketball, NFL, or the Premier League. It's very hard to play those sports at that speed with altered structure. Now, I can play my sport with altered structure because, I do a snowboard really, and I run a little bit. But, at that level, I think you do really need normal healthy structure, or as much normal healthy structure as you can get. And hopefully my PhD will shed some light on that, along with the kinetics associated with it.
That's great. Jarrod, really appreciate you coming on. This was a great conversation.
It was very impromptu.
Yeah, it was good. I loved it. Awesome. Well, if there's anybody that either has any follow-up questions, just wants to follow along on your journey or anything like that, how can they get in touch, read more about you?
I am on Instagram. I think if you just type in my name, Jarrod Antflick, it could be JLA_888, but I'm really not particularly and especially good with social media. I was actually saying to somebody before, I can operate, valved hub and force decks and force frame quite easily, but I'm terrible on Instagram. So, and I don't really use Twitter much anymore. I think I call it Twitter because that's kind of as I know it. But otherwise, I'm at Fortius. I work at Complete Physio in Chelsea as well in London, 5 hours a week. And that's about it.
Amazing. Jarrod, thanks for being on.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Awesome.